Hello horror hounds, welcome back to my A to Z of horror, and we're already at K, and this instalment sees us checking out a 1964 Japanese anthology movie that adapts folkloric ghost stories, directed by Masaki Kobayashi. K is for Kwaidan. This is the point in the video where I always tell you that my A to Z of horror was inspired directly by that of Jambo Shango and Randy Mole, and I'll tell you that in the description field below I'll provide a link to their K installment, Krampus. And it's probably a good point to say that K starting horror movies are fairly thin on the ground. I struggled to find one that I wanted to review, so I plumped for something that seemed to have a bit of prestige. I'd never seen Kwaidan before, but there was a Eureka Masters of Cinema release of it, and then I found out that it was like a 3-hour art house movie, and I thought, now or never, the A to Z of horror is the perfect opportunity to get this sight unseen and check it out, and I am so glad I did. Kwaidan adapts 4 tales. They're all of varying length. I won't go into too much detail about each, but I'll just touch on them. The first story, The Black Hare, which is H-A-I-R rather than the rabbit hare, involves a samurai who leaves his wife to go and seek sort of social progress, standing and money. And the second, The Woman of the Snow, is about a couple of sort of peasant wood gatherers, working class wood gatherers who get caught in a blizzard in the forest and come across a supernatural being that one of them strikes a bargain with. Both of them, in a sense, are real precursors to modern day tales like Jew on the Grudge and Ringu. And although the supernatural female in question in The Woman of the Snow is a Yuki Onna, a snow maiden, rather than an Onryo, a vengeful spirit from that you get in the Grudge, Ju-on, and the Ringu movies, there's definitely a sense of these supernatural, pale female creatures with the long, dark hair that will completely fuck you up. One of the things I loved about The Grudge especially, no, Ring as well, is that there's no real hard and fast morality there. If you come into contact with these creatures, they will fuck you up. You're not being punished for anything or any transgressions or the like. These tales, much more folkloric, do feel a lot more like Japanese folk versions of grim fairy tales. In fact, both these first 2 tales dabble in very similar waters to the Grimm's fairy tales: family, loyalty, trust, fidelity, or lack thereof, bargains made with supernatural entities, and the prices paid for breaking those contracts. After those first 2 stories, we move from these universal and moralistic tales into much more uncertain realms, beginning with the tour de force of this entire film, in my opinion. This clocks in at just over an hour, I think. Hoichi the Earless. Hoichi the Earless concerns a blind musician, or biwa hoshi, whose speciality is singing the tale of the Heike about the Battle of Dan no Ura, fought between the Taira and Minamoto clans during the last phase of the Genpei War. I clipped all of that from Wikipedia. Could you tell? Hoichi is called to sing for a royal family, but his audience is not what he thinks it is. This story, like all the others, but much more so than all the others, unfurls at a stately pace, asks you to enter this realm of the other, of ghosts and spirits. And you spend much more time in the other realm here than you do in any of the other stories. It really gave me future echoes of the Red Lodge, not necessarily the way it looks, perhaps the way it's presented, the vibe that sort of comes off the otherworld realm in this particular story. It's also really notable for floating bits of flame to indicate these spirits that would later pop up in a movie that I've already reviewed for my A to Z of Horror under D, Della Morte dell'Amore by Michele Soavi, who also used the same trick of lighting these balls on fishing wire alight to have them float about the set. The final story is a curious coda, quite short. It's called In a Cup of Tea, and I'd say it's notable because it's an adaptation of an unfinished story. So the film literally says, well, you get to decide what happens next. It feels very much a piece with certain episodes of The Twilight Zone, where a man, as he goes to take a sip from his tea, sees the reflection of a stranger in it. And each time he looks in the reflection, the stranger is closer and closer. There are a few things to say about Kwaidan. First and foremost, it's long. It's long. It was re-edited to 125 minutes in the United States for its theatrical release, basically cutting out The Woman in the Snow, the second story, in its entirety. The full version romps home at just a smidge over 3 hours. This is the version you need to watch, because if you're going to commit to Kwaidan, if you're going to commit to art house adaptations of Japanese folk ghost stories, you either go all in or you don't bother at all. The other thing I should point out is that it's not really scary at all. Not like I found the likes of Ringu and Ju on the Grudge genuinely scary, and in some instances terrifying. With Kwaidan, Kobayashi expected local audiences to be familiar with these basic narratives. What makes Kwaidan stand out is the combination of Kobayashi's insanely patient, methodical approach to the drama, coupled with his expressionistic experiments with colour, sound, and theatrical artifice. It's more like a dreamlike journey into Japanese folklore than a collection of creepy campfire ghost stories. What offsets the pace, which I think is one of the strengths of the film, but if you come to it not forewarned or not ready to buy in to the glacial pace that these stories are going to be told, I can see how it might get under people's skins and they might watch it on fast forward or just eject the whole thing altogether. What makes the film worth visiting and staying with is the colour and the sound. You'll find echoes of Kwaidan in Suspiria and Bram Stoker's Dracula. Specifically in The Woman in the Snow, the painted backdrops, the skies are all filled with huge eyeballs sort of watching these poor hapless mortals unaware of this other realm, unaware that they're continually being watched, instantly made me think of Dracula's eyes appearing in the sky at the start, towards the start of Bram Stoker's Dracula, watching Jonathan Harker on his train journey towards him. Again, a hapless, completely oblivious mortal, soon to tread over that threshold into the world of the supernatural and nightmare. The soundscape is so daring in Kwaidan, dissonant, jarring, atonal, that you will wonder why many, many more films haven't taken their scoring cues from Kwaidan. From what I can bring to mind, only really Mario Bava's masterful anthology Black Sabbath, released just 1 year before Kwaidan, plays in the same kind of sensory sandbox as Kobayashi does here. Toru Takamitsu's score uses expressionistic sounds, bizarre instrumentation. I'm talking like seriously high buzzing sounds, bits of wood being hit, all completely unrelated to the action, and sections of really uneasy quiet as well. It makes the scores for most Western horror films, most Western films, seem depressingly remedial and literal. More like musical signposts for the slow of thought to provide cues as to what emotions you're supposed to be feeling, rather than, as with Kwaidan, another string to the bow, another tool brought to bear, along with the acting, the set design, the camera movement, the colours. Just one more tool brought to bear to create a unifying effect. This film revels in its own artifice. It is shot completely on two sound stages. The sets look like sets, the backdrops are obviously painted, and yet there are times when your breath will be taken away by what you see in front of you. The woman of the snow, the forest setting, is turned into a phantasmagoria with those huge eyes, like I mentioned, watching the protagonist's progress impassively, invisibly through the years. Kobayashi signals abrupt shifts in mood via sudden dynamic changes in lighting within the scene. He doesn't cut away or cut to different lighting. You'll see a character lit one way and then all of a sudden they're lit completely differently. Everything changes. You'll never believe that any of this is taking place in the real world. Everything is clearly artificial. But that doesn't mean that there's not a huge scope in this movie. You'll move from the claustrophobic to the grandly epic. In one segment, you'll become lost in a fairy tale wood during a blizzard. And in a huge section, Hoichi the Earless, you'll witness an entire fog-bound sea battle unfurl before your eyes. All filmed on a soundstage. To my way of thinking, and it might be a particularly Western way of thinking, this artificial approach presents us with a strangely Gnostic view of the world, that people and the supernatural, there are just divine spirits here trapped in an imperfect construct. Or perhaps as viewers we occupy a liminal space straddling the boundary between the ordinary world and the spirit world, able to see the continual intersections between these two, where the players on the stage perceive only what they would call the normal world. You will be left, once you've watched Kwaidan, with a slideshow of images and moods playing around in your mind for days and weeks after watching the film. Not necessarily a unifying grasp of the film, but more like remembered fragments from a dream. So that's K. And we are going to crash transition from the stately, beautiful, fairy tale-like grandeur of Kay and Kwaidan to something quite bold, brash, bonkers, and Britishly ballsy when we learn in the next instalment, please join me, that L is for